The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 72 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. The American Civil War. It took place over 150 years ago, between 1861 and 1865. Over 600,000 Americans lost their lives in that war, and the post-war legacy of the event affects present-day American views and policies on civil rights and race relations. The Civil War stands as a watershed event in United States history. So today, in an effort to better understand the war, we will speak with Civil War historian Ari Kelman, the McCabe Greer Professor of History at the Pennsylvania State University and author of the book Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War. During our conversation, Ari reveals how writing a graphic history differs from writing a traditional history book, details about the day-to-day lives of Union and Confederate soldiers and Union and Confederate civilians, and what life was like in Western regions and the border states. I am really excited about this episode because this is our first episode with a historian from my undergraduate alma mater, Penn State. I attended Penn State from 2000 to 2003, and I have so many great memories of my time there, working at the bookstore, participating in the History Roundtable Club, Creamery Ice Cream, and supporting Thon, the largest student-run philanthropy in the United States. But my favorite memories come from my participation in the Penn State Marching Blue Band. I was a 4-year member of the band. I played trumpet, and I arrived on campus not fully understanding why one had to try out to participate in marching band. In New England, having an interest in marching band made you a bit odd because marching band was simply what one did before concert season began. My bandmates became some of my best friends in college, and they were ever so patient with me. I had traveled outside of New England a lot as a kid, but I'd never lived outside the region until college. So when I arrived on campus, they taught me a lot about Pennsylvania culture. Like, the proper pronunciation of Lancaster is Lancaster, that there are differences between hoagies and heroes, and between cheesesteaks and steak and cheese sandwiches. They also only laughed at me once when I marveled at an Amish buggy going down the street. And admittedly, I felt the need to point out each Amish buggy I saw during our bus trips across Pennsylvania and the Midwest. As you can tell, working on this episode has made me quite nostalgic, and I know you're anxiously waiting to talk about the Civil War. But before we begin, allow me this one last indulgence. In honor of dear old State and the Blue Band, I would like to introduce our guest in style. Using a recording from my senior year in the band, my bandmates and I are going to bring Ari onto the show the same way we brought the football team onto the field, with a bit of fanfare. the McGabe Greer Professor of History at the Pennsylvania State University. His book, A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek, won several awards, including the Bancroft Prize. When not writing, our guest enjoys teaching courses on the Civil War and Reconstruction, environmental history, and Native American history. Today, he has joined us to discuss the American Civil War and his most recent book, Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Ari Kelman.
Thanks so much, Liz. I'm very happy to be here.
You know, Ari, when I crafted your introduction, I left out one important detail that requires a standalone mention. Before Ari became a professor at Penn State, he worked as a professor at the University of California, Davis, where he had the great honor to sign off on my dissertation.
That's probably true. I mean, there's academic laurels, and then there's being a part of history, right? And so I think you were right to do it this way.
I thought so. Let's turn now to our conversation about the American Civil War and your new book, Battle Lines. Bill would like to know how you came up with the idea of writing a graphic history of the Civil War and how writing a graphic history is different from writing a traditional history book.
The way that it's different is there are more pictures. And because I don't know how to draw, it meant that it had to be a collaborative endeavor, which is not the kind of work that I had done probably since I was an undergraduate when I last did group projects, which I always hated. I tend to be pretty solitary in my scholarly endeavors. And this book, because of the nature of the medium, necessitated this kind of a collaboration, which for me was a really, really big stretch. But it ended up working out quite well because Jonathan Federvorm, who is my co-author, and I had a really nice relationship. So that's the honest answer to that question. And related to that is this question of how I decided to write a graphic history of the Civil War. About a year before the beginning of the Civil War sesquicentennial celebration, the beginning of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, I got a phone call from an editor who wanted me to write a very short and very accessible survey of the Civil War. And the word count was so short that I couldn't figure out how to do it. I looked at my lecture notes from my Civil War history class, and I looked at some other books on the Civil War, some other surveys of the Civil War, and I thought about what I could cut and how I could trim and how I could be as concise as possible, and I could not fathom how I could write a history of the war that was under about 65 or 70,000 words. And I think, if I remember correctly, this editor wanted something like half that, so like a really, really short book. And so I passed. And as soon as I said no thanks, I immediately began kicking myself around the block because at the time, nobody except my colleagues at UC Davis thought of me as being a Civil War historian. I had written a first book, which was an environmental history of New Orleans, and everyone still thought of me as being an environmental historian, but that was never really how I thought of myself. That first book was almost an accident. I wrote it as a dissertation because my advisor, the person who I went to graduate school to study with, died in my first year. And so I had to come up with some other topic, and I wrote this book about New Orleans. It really wasn't central to my scholarly identity. And so I, in this case, again, a year before the beginning of the Civil War sesquicentennial, had been offered this opportunity to rebrand myself intellectually as a Civil War historian, and I had said no. And so I spent weeks thinking about whether or not I had made a mistake, and also turning over and over and over and over and over the question of how many words would I actually need in order to tell the story of the Civil War, in order to capture the sweep of this epic and extraordinarily tragic story. And in the end, what I came up with was, if I'm really going to do this with very, very, very few words, I would need an immense number of illustrations. What about the idea of a graphic history of the war?
We've all heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But I don't really think many of us truly understand that saying until we read a graphic history. Ari, you were able to convey so much information about the Civil War through images and without a lot of words.
You're absolutely right. No one really becomes viscerally aware of how true that is until they try and tell a story using pictures. And then it becomes extraordinary how much information one can convey using a single image. And so people who write text-based histories, and by the way, I'm going to continue to do that. I still am going to write text-based histories, not textbooks, but traditional history books. And when I do that kind of work, when I have a problem or when there's a thorny issue that I'm trying to deal with, I simply throw more words at it. That's almost always the solution. And it's not a good solution because everyone tells you when you write that you should be as concise as you possibly can. But nevertheless, the tendency is to try and write one's way out of problems by using more words. And in this kind of a medium, writing graphic histories, there's another way out of those blind alleys, and that's simply to use an image. Now, in the case of this book, I was incredibly fortunate. I had never read any graphic histories. I'm coming out of the closet here with you, Liz, because we're old friends. I'd never even read Maus. I really was a total neophyte. And Jonathan was a very patient tutor. He had written a graphic history already. It was a graphic history of the first atomic bomb called Trinity. And he was willing to be very patient with me and guide me through the process of how you script one of these things and of the centrality of the images to the narrative, that the images aren't a kind of backdrop. Images in a graphic history are actually going to carry the narrative. Not only did we use very few words in this book, but compared to other graphic histories, we used relatively few images because Jonathan's really talented and was able to come up with images that told the story very efficiently.
Let's talk about the Civil War. Would you provide us with a brief overview of when and how the Civil War began?
I'm a so-called McPhersonite. James McPherson wrote, in my view, the single best one-volume history of the Civil War. It's called Battle Cry of Freedom. It's in the Oxford History of the United States series. It won every prize ever. And what McPherson says in Battle Cry, and I think he's right, is that the place to look for the beginning of the Civil War is probably the end of the United States-Mexican War. It's the acquisition of the immense amount of new territory in the Trans-Mississippi West, territory that then became the location in which people would struggle over the question of whether slavery would spread into the West. And it was that struggle over slavery and whether it would be allowed to root itself in this newly acquired Western soil. It was that struggle that really triggered the secession crisis and ultimately the war. Now, I subscribe to this theory for a variety of different reasons, one of which is I think it's relatively elegant, because otherwise you could look to a score of other moments in United States history and say, no, it was the Constitutional Convention, the 3/5 clause, or you could look to the initial importation of African slaves into the American colonies. There are a variety of different places, but I think that this one works well because it is proximate enough to the war that it doesn't get too convoluted, particularly for students, so it teaches well. But I also like it because I'm a Western historian, and as you mentioned in your introduction, I do quite a bit of work on Native peoples during the era of the Civil War. And so I see the Civil War as having been a war of imperialism. And McPherson, I think, feints in that direction in Battle Cry of Freedom. But then, conveniently for me, based on what I'm working on these days, he then drops that issue for the bulk of the book. But he starts there, and then he finishes elsewhere. And from my perspective, it's useful to stay in the West and understand the war throughout, and then through the period of Reconstruction as well, as having been a fight over what shape an American empire in the West was going to take.
The first major battle of the Civil War took place on July 21, 1861, not far from Manassas, Virginia. We know this battle either as First Battle of Bull Run or First Manassas. In battle lines, Ari and his illustrator, Jonathan Fetter Form, depict well-dressed men, women, and children standing atop a grassy hillside. These men, women, and children have gathered as if they are about to enjoy a day at the horse races. And you've seen this image, right? The spectators wear fancy hats, have picnic baskets, and some have even brought opera glasses to better view the day's event. Only they haven't gathered to watch a horse race. They've gathered to watch men fight. Ari, did men and women really gather near the battlefield to watch the first major battle of the Civil War as if it were a spectator sport?
They did. And as you point out, some of them carried opera glasses. Each of the chapters of the book, we use an object as a way of opening up a new perspective on a story that might otherwise be relatively well known. And so in this case, the story of First Bull Run is a story that lots and lots of people know very, very well. It turned into a Confederate rout. It was a very, very closely fought battle. But in the end, the Union lines broke and the Union Army ended up in disarray and on the run, and the Confederates carried the day. People know this story. And so we wanted a way of trying to provide some new angle on this event. And so what we did is we focused on opera glasses. We focused on these people who were watching this battle unfold, and we tried to recreate what it might have been like for an upper-class audience, for people who were perhaps the wives or the relatives of the officers who were fighting, or who were politicians coming from Washington, D.C., or otherwise individuals who came out, who lined the hills around the battlefield and who watched this event unfold, and unfold in a way that they were not anticipating at all. Because early in the war, many, many people in both the North and the South believed that the conflict would last a very short time. Northerners believed that the war would end quickly and that the Union would be reunited. Southerners believed that Yankees were effete and that they lacked the warrior spirit, and so they, Confederates, were going to be able to secure their independence and become their own nation. And both sides entered into the war with this sense of overweening confidence. And at First Bull Run, these spectators, what they witnessed was, rather than a kind of a glorious spectacle, they saw carnage. And they saw the dark side of war. And so that's what we really hoped to do for readers, is give them some sense, the way in which that episode was one of the transformative moments during the war.
One of the strengths of Battle Lines is that it talks about the lived experience of the war as opposed to the military aspects of the war. To that end, Ari, I wonder if you could tell us, what was day-to-day life like for the soldiers in both the Union and Confederate armies?
One of our principal goals with the book was to at least strike a balance between military history and a history of, as you say, the day-to-day experiences of soldiers, but also individuals on the home front. And so in terms of the experiences of soldiers during the war, we have an immense number of soldiers' diaries available to us. And Jonathan and I spent a lot of time looking at these diaries to try and figure out what we wanted to convey to readers. And we wanted to try and get across several different points. First of all, that being a soldier in the Civil War for the vast majority of the time was intensely boring. Most of the time, Civil War soldiers didn't do much except wait. They waited for the next battle. So it was boredom that was seasoned with anxiety. Then we wanted to convey to readers that being a soldier involved an extraordinary amount of hardship, particularly for Confederate soldiers who were not very well equipped or very well fed. And as the war dragged on and on and on, remember again that both sides believed it was going to be a brief war, but in fact it dragged on for years. And as it dragged on, Confederate soldiers were underfed, they were poorly clothed, they had insufficient shelter. It was very, very difficult physically and, of course, emotionally. And that was the final thing that we really wanted to convey to readers, was that while the war was, as I said a moment ago, very boring in many instances, it was also emotionally ruinous for many of these soldiers, because the experience of battle was so gruesome, because casualty rates were so extraordinarily high, because the kinds of wounds that soldiers were experiencing were so devastating, because the death and the carnage around them could be a kind of totalizing experience, that soldiers suffered from what in later wars would be called shell shock or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we wanted readers to come away from this book with a sense that while there were many ways in which the Civil War was a moment of triumph, there were many ways in which the Civil War was an extraordinarily important event in American history. It was also quite a tragedy at a human, at a personal level.
You touched upon the shared and different experiences of Union and Confederate soldiers. But what about the experiences of African American soldiers? Did white and African American Civil War soldiers have similar wartime experiences?
It was very, very different. First of all, African American soldiers were in segregated units. Second of all, they were paid less than white soldiers. Third of all, they faced a great deal more danger if they went into battle, because the Confederate Congress chose not to treat African American soldiers using the same rules of war that they used to treat white soldiers in the Union Army, and on and on and on. These were radically different experiences of warfare, and there's not really any other way to put it other than to say that these were genuinely disparate experiences.
Many of us have heard that the Union Army suffered from poor leadership until Ulysses S. Grant took command in March 1863. Ari, is what we have heard about the Union Army a fact or a myth?
Well, first of all, there's not a single Union Army, right? There are Union armies. And so Ulysses S. Grant actually rose to command in the West and did a very good job in many ways, which is why Lincoln ultimately chose to bring him back east and place him in charge of the Army of the Potomac and ultimately make him general-in-chief of the Union armies. So it's slightly more complicated, but there's more than a kernel of truth in that statement, because certainly the Union armies in the East were not particularly well commanded at the highest levels. The classic example of this is General George McClellan, who was an extraordinarily controversial figure during the war and certainly has remained so in the years since. McClellan was, by all accounts, a very, very able commander of men. He was very, very gifted when it came to turning raw recruits into well-trained soldiers. But when it came time actually to commit those soldiers to battle, McClellan seems to have lost his nerve again and again and again, and rather famously sent a series of dispatches to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, to the President of the United States and his Commander-in-Chief, Abraham Lincoln, about all of the reasons that he could not engage with the enemy. He often believed he was outnumbered, even though just the opposite was true. He typically had many more troops than his opposites. He believed that the ground was never good enough for a fight, and so on and so forth. Having said that, McClellan was in charge for one of the most important turning points in the war, the Union victory at Antietam, which became the triggering event that allowed Abraham Lincoln to hand down the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. But nevertheless, McClellan is sort of the poster boy for the blundering Union commanding generals, and there were a number after him as well. And so I do think it's fair to say that it's not until Grant is in charge that the Union Army, particularly in the East, has really effective leadership. Now, again, I said it was more complicated than that. I'm going to make it even more complicated than I already have because, right, I'm a historian and I can't help myself. There's always got to be more complexity. Having said that about the highest commanding generals, the officer corps in the Union Army seems actually to have been very, very effective in many instances, despite the fact that often they were elected and so they were political officers. Nevertheless, they seem to have done a pretty good job by most measures. It's really just those generals who were a problem until Grant comes east.
Should we use the plural form of armies when we discuss the Confederate Army too?
Sure. There are a variety of different armies in the West and in the East. The most famous of the armies during the Civil War are Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and first McClellan, and then much later Grant's Army of the Potomac. But there are a number of other armies as well. There are plural armies, yes.
In addition to discussing the life and death of Civil War soldiers, Battle Lines also offers glimpses into how the Civil War affected the lives of civilian men and women. Ari, would you tell us about civilian life during the Civil War? What was day-to-day life like for the men and women back home?
As with the case of soldiers, it depended to a great extent on the race, ethnicity, the social class, but also probably more important even than that, the part of the country in which an individual lived. The Civil War was tremendously hard on the Confederate home front. There often wasn't enough to eat. Large swaths of the Confederacy were occupied by Union soldiers. Those areas that lived under Union occupation bristled. They felt like they were dealing with tyranny. I should add, they felt that way even though Union occupying forces often did a very, very good job. Rather famously, the city of New Orleans had a series of extraordinarily brutal yellow fever epidemics in the years leading up to the Civil War, but during the Union occupation, there was no yellow fever epidemic, and there are some historians of medicine and public health who argue that that's because the Union occupation was incredibly efficient and kept the city cleaner during the war. Nevertheless, people living in the Confederacy felt the way that people who live under occupying armies often feel. They felt like they were struggling beneath the boot of oppression. And so that was very difficult. And then again, the Confederate home front groaned beneath the weight of terrible economic problems. There was runaway inflation in the Confederacy throughout the war. This was particularly difficult for people who were poorer, who were living hand to mouth. This is always the case with hyperinflation. It strikes the poor the hardest. And so there were bread riots in Richmond, Virginia, and there was a very, very large and vibrant anti-war movement in the Confederacy that tended often to be rooted among women who became anti-war activists during the conflict. Meanwhile, in the Union, things were, relatively speaking, okay. The Union economy actually did quite well during the war. Nevertheless, there was, again, a large anti-war movement that tended to be driven by immigrants, again, most famously, or perhaps infamously, the case of the New York City draft riots, a massive civil insurrection in which well over 100 people were killed, tens of millions of dollars of property damage done by rioting mobs that were infuriated that the federal government had instituted a draft. These were mostly immigrant men in New York City who were not interested in fighting a war that they believed had become a war of liberation, a war to free African American slaves, who these immigrants didn't have a great deal of sympathy for and also didn't want to compete with in a labor market. The idea that 4 million African American slaves might be freed and would flow as a flood into the labor market was something that didn't sit well with these immigrants who were struggling themselves socioeconomically. And so again, there was an anti-war movement in the Union as well, despite the fact that times were better during the war in the Union than they were during the Confederacy.
In the second chapter of Battle Lines, Ari and Jonathan describe how Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were slave states, but slave states that chose to remain in the Union. Chelsea would like to know more about life in these border states. Ari, would you tell us about the political divisions within these states? How did the tensions that these divisions created affect everyday life for the men and women who lived there?
Well, I think the experiences of men and women who lived in those states differed, again, depending on which state you're talking about. Missouri was kind of a violent borderland throughout much of the Civil War. There were non-uniformed Confederate guerrillas who were fighting against Union forces in Missouri. Missouri was so badly divided that it basically had no functioning government for much of the war. Kentucky also was very, very badly divided. Kentucky was the closest to the sort of myth of brother against brother that still in some circles what one hears about as a hallmark of the Civil War. Kentucky was really very, very badly divided. And again, there was quite a bit of violence within Kentucky during the war. Delaware, for all intents and purposes, was a free state. Delaware had very, very few slaves within it before the war, almost no pro-Confederate sympathy. And so Delaware was, relatively speaking, as compared to Kentucky and Missouri, relatively placid throughout the war. And Maryland was also divided. Rather famously, there was the case of, again, a kind of an insurrection early in the war. The 1st Regiment of Union soldiers that was making its way toward Washington, D.C. at the very beginning of the war was attacked in Baltimore en route to Washington, D.C. This led to a very lengthy and very, very hotly contested civil liberties dispute in which the Lincoln administration threw one of the leaders of this insurrection into jail and basically let him rot there for quite a long time. And so Maryland, again, had significant divisions within it, but not quite to the same extent as Missouri and Kentucky.
Rhonda would like to know whether California and Californians took part in the war. And if so, what role did the Golden State and its people play in the Civil War?
I'm going to duck that question to some extent because I think that the most important role that California played in the Civil War was as one of the triggers. California, of course, was most famous in the period for its gold rush. The gold rush led tens and ultimately hundreds of thousands of people to move to California very, very quickly, either seeking gold or to take part in kind of ancillary industries that grew up to try and mine the miners, right, to try and make money off of the people who were actually going to go into the foothills of the Sierra and look for gold. And once California had a huge population and had a vibrant economy, it wanted to become a state. It wanted to move from territorial status to statehood, and California's interest in becoming a state was one of the critical mile markers on the road to the war, because California wanted to be admitted as a free state, and Southern legislators in the United States Senate and Congress were loath to see that happen because they believed that it would tip the balance of power toward anti-slavery forces. And so the struggle over California's fate and whether it would be admitted was one of the most important moments that led toward the war. And I hope Rhonda's going to forgive me, but I think that's really the most critical role that California played in the saga of the war.
Rosa would like to know about carpetbaggers and copperheads. Would you tell us what carpetbaggers and copperheads were and what role they played in the Civil War?
Sure. Copperheads, this was the name for the people who were part of the anti-war movement in the North. The Copperheads were a wing of the Democratic Party in the North. The Democratic Party in the North was basically moribund at the beginning of the Civil War, and as the war continued over the course of years, the Democratic Party revived itself, reorganized itself, but in some instances remained divided internally, and one of the key wings of the Democratic Party was its anti-war wing, which these anti-war Democrats were known as Copperheads. And they played a very, very important role on the home front. They were one of the major threats that the Lincoln administration faced throughout the war, and also the source of a great number of the major civil liberties disputes during the conflict. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who went south after the war to take part in Reconstruction, and in American memory have been cast as villains, particularly in films like Birth of a Nation, but also in Gone with the Wind. It's the carpetbaggers who don't understand or respect Southern culture, who typically are very, very corrupt, often are sexually licentious, and so on and so forth. In fact, historians now look back on this characterization of carpetbaggers and think that this is, if not wholly, then at least largely a matter of myth, that carpetbaggers in many instances, Northerners who again went south during Reconstruction, were well-meaning, they were reformers, in some instances they were evangelicals, but the so-called lost cause mythology still predominates in parts of American culture, and so I think carpetbagger still gets used as a slur. I know that when I went to New Orleans to do my research for my first book, The History of New Orleans and its relationship with the Mississippi River, when I first arrived, an archivist at one of New Orleans' really extraordinarily great document repositories, sort of half in jest, called me an intellectual carpetbagger, that I was coming to carry away the South's great historical treasures and bring them with me like some sort of a Yankee looter, carry them back with me to the North. I think she was kidding, but I don't know.
Let's transition to the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Ari, Matthew would like to know, in your opinion, what might have happened if Ulysses S. Grant had not been in charge of the Union's Western campaign in the summer of 1863? Would the Union have captured Vicksburg? Would Sherman have marched to Atlanta? How would the course of the Civil War have been different?
You know, my very, very good friend and sometimes collaborator, former colleague at UC Davis, Eric Rauchway, taught me that counterfactuals are actually extraordinarily valuable. I used to dismiss them out of hand, almost reflexively, but Eric always made the point that counterfactuals are a very, very good way to test a hypothesis. Let's see here. So what would have happened if Grant hadn't been in charge? Well, let's assume that Sherman would have been in charge. By the summer of 1863, Sherman, like Grant, had sort of edged ever closer toward embracing a war of attrition as an important tactic. Sherman, like Grant, had become aware that their army could actually live off the land, that long supply lines, which earlier in the war had been bedeviled by Confederate cavalry in the Western theater of the war, that those long supply lines were no longer necessary. And so I'm going to say that Sherman would have done a good job, that Vicksburg very likely would have fallen, because again, by the summer of 1863, Sherman had, as I said, edged quite close to Grant's tactical positions. I'm going to say that Vicksburg would have fallen, perhaps not quite as quickly, and that Sherman then very likely would have taken his army east, would have moved on Atlanta, and then after taking Atlanta, would very likely have marched to the sea. Having said that, the problem with this kind of an answer, and now I'm going to try and weasel out of everything that I just said, Liz, okay? The problem with this kind of answer is that it ignores historical contingency, right? It ignores the many, many things that happen that nobody can predict, things that fall outside of structural factors, that fall outside of great leadership, that fall outside of anything that anyone can predict. And so it's really hard to know what would have happened. And I hope Matthew's going to forgive me for that kind of, as I say, a totally weaselly answer.
Penn State is home to the oldest collegiate creamery in the United States. Would you tell us what your favorite Penn State Creamery ice cream flavor is and what you are researching and writing about now?
Well, I mean, I think we both know which of those things is more important. So let's do ice cream first. They have a really good mint chip. I've always been a big fan of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and the Penn State Creamery's mint chip ice cream may be the very, very best that I've had. My son, though, who is a huge ice cream fan, and they have some sort of a multiple chocolate thing where it's chocolate ice cream with chocolate something and chocolate chip and this and that and the other thing, and it's really fantastic. And my wife likes Peachy Paterno, which is still named for Joe Paterno. What am I working on right now? I'm working on a bunch of different things right now. I'm trying to do another graphic book with Jonathan. There are a couple of different topics that we're interested in working on. One is a book about the road to and from the Little Bighorn battle. Another one is a book that I am hoping to work on with Jonathan and also, as I mentioned, Eric Rauchway. I would very, very much like to do a graphic history of World War II, a kind of survey of World War II. And it's a topic that lends itself to a graphic history because there's an immense amount of visual evidence left from the war. And so it would translate well into this kind of a medium. And then I'm writing a big historical monograph, or I think it's a monograph, I haven't decided, about the relationship between the United States Civil War and Reconstruction and what historians have traditionally called the Indian Wars, the Plains Indian Wars. And the upshot of that book is that the Civil War, which became a war of liberation in 1862 and 1863, but began as a war of empire, that it remained a war of empire even after it transformed into a war of liberation, and that Reconstruction, which we traditionally think of through the lens of North and South, was also extraordinarily important in the West because it was a moment in which Republicans made good on promises to people, particularly their constituents, about the kind of an American empire that they were going to build in the Trans-Mississippi West. And that empire building project necessitated the dispossession and slaughter of lots of Native American peoples.
Well, you've made my day. Not only is your work exciting, but I haven't been back to State College in over 10 years, and my favorite creamery flavor, bittersweet mint, is still available. Thank you for that news.
Yeah, well, but Liz, we're going to have to remedy this. We have to get you out here to give a talk about this podcast because, as you know, there is a huge move afoot within the Historical Academy to try and figure out ways that graduate students and faculty alike can make their work public. And you're doing that better than almost anyone else I know, right? You are a huge success story. And so this department needs to claim you, and we need to get you back out here so that you can give a public lecture.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Ari. But Penn Staters may disown me when they discover that I enrolled in Penn State without knowing who Joe Paterno was. In fact, I had to ask someone at marching band practice who this Joe Paterno guy was that everyone kept talking about because I was clueless.
I love that story. I think you're going to have to tell that when you're here.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can get in contact with you if we still have questions?
I've got a website. If people Google me, I'm at arikelman.org. I'm on Facebook, and I am easy to email. And I would be delighted to hear from your listeners. I'd love to continue conversations with people via email, or I can always chat with people on the phone. And one of my very, very favorite things to do is, if you have history teachers in your audience, and I'm sure you must, I love to Skype into classrooms, middle school and high school.
Ari Kelman, thank you for guiding us through some of the details of the American Civil War.
It's really, really been my pleasure, Liz. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
A picture is worth 1,000 words. If you are looking for a fairly thorough overview of the American Civil War, you should check out Ari and Jonathan's book, Battle Lines. Their use of images not only brings the war to life in a way that is meaningful, if a bit haunting, but it also tells you a lot about the war without a lot of words. Although sparse on words, This graphic history reveals a lot of details about military life, civilian life, battle tactics, and how the war impacted the lives of slaves and the environment. Please keep in mind, this is not a book to share with your grade school children. This is a book for adults and perhaps kids in high school. At times, the graphics are quite, well, graphic. They depict violence and lost limbs. They are really in line with the war that they portray. You can find more information about Ari, his book Battle Lines, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/072. You could also access the show notes by clicking on the link in your Ben Franklin's World app. If you don't have this free app yet, you will find it in your favorite app store. Just search for Ben Franklin or Ben Franklin's World. If you love Ben Franklin's World, please consider joining the movement to help support the show and its mission to restore history to the forefront of the public mind. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement or text support BF World to 33444. These actions will bring you to an information page, which also includes a short, cool behind-the-scenes video about the show. Finally, what questions do you still have about the Civil War? Send your questions to Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in the listener community on Facebook. Also, if you have sent me voice questions through the Ask the Historian link on benfranklinsworld.com, please know I am working on getting your answers incorporated into the show.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.